And we're back, micro students, part 3 of the chemistry chapter 2. We're going to pick up talking about chemical reactions. As you may know, reactions are really just new arrangements of atoms into different molecules. All chemistry involves reactants, which are the components that begin the reaction, and the products, which are the end result. In biology, however, almost all reactions that take place in a cell are driven by enzymes. Therefore, something to keep in mind is that reactants are referred to as substrates in biology, because enzymes are going to play a role in allowing the reaction to happen to give you the products that life requires. Enzymes work on substrates. We'll be coming back to that idea in a later chapter of the class. Now let's go over a couple of different types of reactions that are really important to cells. The first is a synthesis reaction. Synthesis means to produce something. In life, the formation of larger, more complex molecules always is going to require energy. These are termed endothermic reactions. So remember, requiring energy is endothermic. Endo refers to in for input. This is what's going to happen when you make more complex molecules from less complex substrates or reactants. The most common type of synthesis reaction is a dehydration synthesis reaction. Let's break that term down. Synthesis, we've already defined. We're making something. And dehydration, what do you think about when you hear this term? Hopefully, you think of water, specifically removing water to dry something out. Well, in these dehydration reactions, that's what's happening. A water molecule is going to be removed. The atoms needed to form water are broken off, water is formed and released. When you do the reaction, water is going to be a result of. It will come out of the reaction. It's removed from the components. If you look at the bottom here, you'll see that we have some shapes that are representing some small molecules, some subunit type of component, and we're going to join them together. When we join them, there's going to be a hydroxyl, this little OH right here at the end of the small molecule, and a hydrogen on the other that are going to be removed to combine. They come out of the reaction as water in order to form the covalent bond between those two small molecules. Water's removed, and you see in the center, the arrow is showing that the reaction is moving forward. The small molecules becoming larger molecules. Water was a resulting product, and energy had to be put into that reaction. When we're talking about cells, we're talking about chemical reactions that are part of metabolism. Synthesis reactions are creating things for the cell. That's called anabolism. So something to keep in mind, something you might want to jot down in your notes to keep everything straight. If we're synthesizing something, it's going to require energy. Therefore, it's endothermic, and it's part of anabolism, the building portion of metabolism. The most common type of building reaction is under the category of a dehydration synthesis, where a water molecule is going to be formed and removed from the components as they join together into the larger molecule. Next, let's look at the opposite of synthesis. These are the breakdown reactions, otherwise known as decomposition reactions. Decomposition is going to break bonds in a larger molecule to make smaller molecules. Essentially, it's the reverse of what we just discussed. Since we're discussing a type of opposing reaction, the fact that we see a release of energy from these reactions should seem logical. Releasing energy from a reaction, that's termed exothermic. Exo refers to out. So we're getting energy out, sometimes heat out of the reaction. Energy is released as the reaction occurs. The most common type of decomposition reaction is a hydrolysis reaction. If you look at this term, you might be able to figure out what it means by just looking at it. Hydro means water, and lysis means splitting. So we're going to split water in these decomposition reactions. If you look at the example down at the bottom, it looks essentially like the reverse of what we just examined in the dehydration synthesis. We have the larger molecules with these subunits linked together, and they require water to be split in order to do this work. Energy will be released in this reaction. You can see that the split water is used to replace the hydroxyl, the OH, and the hydrogen on the subunits so that they can exist independently and satisfy all those rules of valence electrons. This is a decomposition reaction. These breakdown reactions of metabolism are referred to as catabolism. So anabolism builds up, catabolism breaks down. We'll only spend a moment talking about exchange reactions. They're not as important to our understanding of upcoming sections. A simple explanation is good enough for us. They still involve breaking and forming covalent bonds. We're going to make new molecules from previous molecules by moving atoms around, but these reactions are not synthesis or dehydration reactions. I'll probably point out a few exchange reactions that are occurring in specific steps when we're looking at the metabolism section of our lectures in Chapter 5. But we're not going to spend much time with them. They are a part of metabolism. If you were taking a biochemistry class, you would likely pay closer attention to them than we will here. So metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions that are taking place within a cell, and hence within an organism. All the anabolic reactions, all the catabolic reactions, all of the endothermic and exothermic reactions, every reaction within a cell is part of metabolism. In this next section, we're going to talk about water, acids, bases, and salts. Water is the most abundant substance in organisms. That's probably not a surprise to you. You probably learned in elementary school that we are composed mostly of water. Water is the most abundant substance in your cells. Therefore, your cells are an aqueous environment, a watery environment. That's very important. Remember that water is a polar molecule. Because it has polar covalent bonds making up the water molecule, it allows the water molecule to make hydrogen bonds between itself and to orient itself so that opposite charges face dissolved substances, as we saw in the earlier part of this chapter. When water molecules orient around substances, it will help keep them suspended, and thus water is an excellent solvent. Stuff really readily dissolves in it. Those hydrogen bonds also make the water molecule somewhat cohesive. They actually kind of stick to each other. That leads to surface tension, which you can visualize here with this water strider. It's basically standing on water. The water molecules are stuck to themselves with hydrogen bonds, so there's a little bit of resistance to this insect that's standing on the surface of the water. Water also remains liquid across a wide range of temperatures and can absorb a significant amount of energy without changing temperature. These characteristics are related to the fact that the water molecule is making hydrogen bonds, and therefore the making and breaking of these bonds keeps water liquid across a much wider range of temperatures than some other type of liquid. Just imagine something like alcohol. If you put a drop of alcohol and a drop of water on a table, and the drops are of equal size or equal volume, and then you wait to see which one evaporates faster, you'll notice that the alcohol evaporates faster. You would have imagined that in your mind if you've dealt with these two solvents at all in your life. Water remains liquid. It's not going to evaporate as a steam as readily as something else like alcohol. Water is going to absorb significant amounts of energy without really changing the temperature, which is helpful for the life that has to exist within specific temperature ranges. Just think of ourselves for a moment and kind of relate that to the microbes or other organisms living in water. We have to exist within a specific temperature range, If it gets too hot or too cold, then we'll perish, much like the organisms living in a pond or a lake or the ocean, if the temperature swings too far from normal. Water helps life by helping to maintain the temperature. Water itself participates in many chemical reactions, as we were just demonstrating with dehydration synthesis and in the hydrolysis reactions. The next figure is showing you how the water molecule can form these hydrogen bonds. This is showing the central water molecule with the maximal number of hydrogen bonds interacting with other water molecules. If you notice, the central water molecule has a hydrogen bond forming from each of its hydrogen components. And it's forming to the oxygen end of another water molecule. Remember, with hydrogen bonds, the opposite ends attract. So the hydrogen end of one water molecule is attracted to the oxygen end of another water molecule. That same phenomenon is happening over here with this water molecule and this hydrogen and oxygen. When you're looking at that central water molecule, the oxygen has the capacity and the physical space to form two hydrogen bonds with two other water molecules. The central water molecule orients itself like shown. Practice drawing this from memory and indicate the hydrogen bonds. And I'm going to ask you a question for you to ponder. Where do you think that this maximal hydrogen bonding occurs? Did something come to mind? If not, I'm going to give you some multiple choice and you tell me, what do you think? Will you see this type of scenario in liquid water, in steam, meaning water as gas, or in frozen water, meaning ice? If you said ice, you're correct. In ice, this is the orientation of the hydrogen bonds. In liquid water, there might be some water molecules that are doing this for some split second, but there's a lot of jostling around and kinetic energy causing the hydrogen bonds to form and break. In the conditions of liquid water, the molecules are moving so fast that many of the molecules are not oriented like this image. The molecules are constantly shifting positions and changing, which is why liquid water is more dense than ice. With all of the shifting around, water molecules overall, on average, tend to be closer together than what's depicted here, which is in ice. In ice, the water molecules are spread out like this, and you can imagine this orientation repeating over and over again with the neighboring water molecules bonding to the more external water molecules. It forms and organizes a crystal so that ice tends to be less dense because there's more space between each of the molecules themselves. Hopefully that answered the question that had been nagging at you for so long about why ice floats on the top of liquid water, even though it's a solid. Before we end this lecture, we need to still talk about a few more things concerning water, acids, and bases. An acid is a molecule that when you add it to water, you have at least one hydrogen ion coming off of that molecule. If a molecule dissociates into a hydrogen ion and some other ion, then it's an acid. You have a base when you have a hydroxyl, the OH group, that dissociates from a molecule in water. This is the definition of an acid or a base. When acids and bases dissolve, you have an H+ ion or an OH- ion, and also will have an additional anion or cation. When you think about life, our metabolism requires a relatively constant balance of acid and base because we have to have a relatively narrow pH scale for our particular cell components to work. A buffer is a component that, when it's in solution, will help prevent drastic changes in pH. A buffer can absorb a hydrogen ion or absorb a hydroxyl ion. The result is that when a buffer is present, the pH will end up being fairly stable. While we're not going to talk much about buffers, they really are important for life. You'll probably talk about some of the buffers in your bloodstream when you take physiology. Buffers are also something we use in scientific research often because the biochemical reactions also require a specific pH range to work. Microorganisms, just like any other organism, will have a particular pH tolerance. Different microorganisms will have differences in their tolerance. Some microorganisms like acidic environments, and others like alkaline, meaning basic environments, while still others like a near neutral environment. It depends on the microorganism. Some microbes, especially ones that tend to be pathogenic, ones that cause problems in humans, they can actually change the pH of their environment, or at least their microenvironment existing around the cell. The organism that causes peptic ulcers in humans does this. It can neutralize the stomach acid surrounding the cell with an enzyme that produces a basic substance. We'll talk a bit about those organisms late in the semester. So hopefully this dissociation might remind you about what's happening when we talked about ions and ionic bonds. But in this case, we're talking about acids and bases. Acids and bases, when added to water, will dissociate into cations and anions. If we have an acid, we get an H plus and an anion as the other part of the acidic molecule. For a base, you get a hydroxyl ion and a cation for the other component of the molecule. If you imagine back to the diagram of the solutes in water, you can imagine how the water molecules are interacting with these different charged components of acids and bases. Can you imagine the orientation of the water molecules around the charged ions? That's a little thought exercise that would be helpful for you to do on your own. Do a drawing of some of the water molecules around the charged components and pay attention to the poles of the water molecules. Convince yourself, how would they be oriented? When we talk about water, acids, and bases, we need to consider the pH scale. The pH scale covers a range from 0 to 14. It's a reflection of the concentration of the hydrogen ions. In other courses, you might go through the equation. The log of the concentration of the hydrogen ion equals the pH value. We don't need to do that in this course, but we do need to understand how the scale works. Solutions that are acidic have a pH of less than 7. Showing go up on this scale. Solutions that are alkaline or basic have a pH value that are greater than 7. For every move along the scale, we're talking about a concentration difference of 10 times. This is a log scale. For example, if we went from water that's absolutely pure with nothing dissolved in it, no gases, no carbon dioxide, no anything, then its pH is going to be 7. There's exactly equal amounts of hydroxyl and hydrogen ions. H2O is split into an H plus and an OH minus. In water, some small percentage of the molecules will split apart into a hydrogen ion and a hydroxyl ion. Therefore, they will be in equal amounts. If you combine those back together, you have water again. Pure water will have a small amount of molecules that have broken down or dissociated into those two components, but they'll be precisely in equal concentration, so the pH is 7. If you move down the scale to pH 6 from 7, you have 10 times more hydrogen ions. Likewise, if you went from 7 to 8, you have 10 times less hydrogen ions and 10 times more hydroxyl ions. So here's a question for you to consider. And if you can't figure it out, I need you to reach out to me. What happens if the solution went from pH 7 to pH 5? How many more hydrogen ions is there in 5 compared to 7? Do you think it's now 20 times more? Or did it get a concentration of 100 times more hydrogen ions? That's something that students sometimes get confused about. It should be 100 times more. If you can't figure out how we got the answer to that question, you need to ask for clarification. Salts are our next topic, but since it has taken enough time for one sitting, we're going to pick up with that topic on the 4th video or mini lecture in this chapter. As I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, we have quite a few sections in this particular chapter on chemistry. It has a lot of concepts within it. All right, see you all next time.